President Donald Trump has threatened to block the opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge, even as Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney pushes back on the idea and insists the project will move forward. But the sharper story is not the political theater in Washington or Ottawa. It is the freight market, where carriers have already started shifting traffic away from Windsor and toward Sarnia. The bridge fight is playing out against a much less dramatic reality on the ground. Logistics companies have been rerouting trucks based on cost, congestion, and reliability, not campaign rhetoric. And that shift has already cut into Windsor's position as a key crossing point. In other words, while politicians are still arguing over who gets to claim leverage, the supply chain has been making its own decision. That is why Trump's threat lands as more noise than strategy. The Gordie Howe Bridge was designed to ease cross-border bottlenecks, but freight operators are watching a broader map now, and the numbers are not flattering for Windsor. If a route adds delays, uncertainty, or extra expense, truckers do not wait for a press conference to tell them what to do. Carney's response has been to frame the bridge as a long-term infrastructure asset, not a bargaining chip. His government has argued that the project is too important to be derailed by political brinkmanship, especially with billions of dollars in trade moving across the corridor each year. But that defense misses the more immediate point. The market has already begun adjusting, and it is doing so quietly. Sarnia has benefited from that adjustment because freight follows efficiency, not slogans. Carriers have been choosing the path that gets goods across the border with fewer headaches, and that has made the Windsor crossing less dominant than it once was. The result is a practical warning to both governments. Political fights can delay headlines, but they do not automatically move trucks back. For now, the bridge remains a symbol of cross-border ambition, but the real test is happening in dispatch offices and on loading docks. The trucks have already voted. The fight over the bridge is no longer just about infrastructure. It has become a proxy battle over trade, leverage, tariffs, and who gets to control the flow of goods across the Detroit River. Washington has treated the Gordie Howe International Bridge as a bargaining chip, while Ottawa has framed it as a long-term public asset. But the commercial reality is less theatrical. Carriers are already making decisions based on cost and reliability, not political messaging. That matters because tariffs have turned every crossing into a price calculation. When duties rise, shippers look for the cheapest clean route, and when uncertainty grows, they move freight to the lane that reduces delays and paperwork. In that environment, a bridge is not just steel and concrete. It is a competitive asset. And the argument over ownership is really an argument over who captures the economic upside when trade volumes shift. The ownership dispute has also sharpened the politics. Canadian officials have emphasized that the bridge is part of a broader public interest strategy, while Trump's rhetoric has pushed the issue into a familiar America First frame. If the U.S. can extract leverage, it should. But that framing runs headfirst into the market's own logic, because truckers and logistics planners do not wait for either capital to agree on the script. Data from Commercial Crossings shows why the debate is so awkward for Windsor. Blue Water Bridge has been outpacing Ambassador Bridge in freight traffic, underscoring how commercial carriers have already been voting with their routes. The shift is not a one-off blip. It reflects a steady preference for crossings that are less congested and more predictable, even as the political class keeps pretending it can still assign the traffic. That commercial gap is the part neither side can spin away. If one crossing is handling more trucks more often, then the leverage is moving with the freight, not the press release. Politics may still control the talking points, but the numbers suggest the market has already chosen its lane, and the next phase will be about who adapts fastest before the corridor's balance hardens into a new normal. Politics is chasing logistics, not leading it. The 2022 blockade exposed how fragile the Windsor corridor had become, with a single choke point able to freeze supply chains, strand freight, and push carriers toward alternate crossings that could keep moving. When the disruption hit, the lesson was blunt. If a route is slowed by protests, inspections, or political theater, truckers do not wait around for symbolism to clear the lane. That episode also showed how quickly toll math can change behavior. A few dollars difference per crossing, multiplied across hundreds of trips a month, becomes real money for fleets that live on thin margins. Fuel costs and delivery windows measured in hours. In that world, the cheapest legal route is not a talking point, it is a survival strategy. Route efficiency mattered even more than the headline fight. Carriers were comparing not just tolls, but border wait times, customs friction, highway access, and the risk of getting trapped in a backup that could blow up a day's schedule. The faster crossing was often the one that reduced idling, paperwork, and missed appointments, which is why logistics planners kept moving freight toward the lane that made operational sense instead of the one that made for better political theater. That is the part the rhetoric keeps trying to gaslight away. For shippers, a bridge is not a monument, not a campaign prop, and not a Karen-level moral flex about sovereignty. It is a cost center or a cost saver, depending on how it performs on a Tuesday morning when 40 trucks are stacked up and a warehouse is waiting. If one crossing shaves minutes and dollars off the route, it wins business without needing a flag-waving speech. The 2022 disruption also hardened a basic market truth. Reliability compounds. Once carriers reroute and build new schedules, they start locking in dispatch habits, contracts, and customer expectations around the cheaper, faster path. Even when the original route reopens, the old traffic does not always come back because logistics networks remember pain and reward, predictability. That is why the current dispute is so awkward for politicians trying to frame it as a patriotic showdown. The freight market is not voting on identity. It is scoring lanes on time, cost, and risk. And it keeps handing out the same verdict. The cost difference is reshaping the map. Reuters, the White House, Michigan officials, Canadian ministers, and trucking executives all converged on the same point this week. The fight over cross-border freight is no longer theoretical, and the cost of political brinkmanship is landing on the people and businesses moving goods between the two countries. Reuters reported that White House officials have been weighing how far to push tariff threats and other trade measures without triggering broader disruption in one of North America's most tightly linked commercial corridors. That caution is not charity. It is an acknowledgement that the border is a live wire, and when Washington starts swinging, the shock does not stay in the political arena for long. Michigan leaders have been even more explicit about the stakes. State officials and business groups have warned that any escalation that slows truck traffic, complicates customs processing, or shifts freight patterns away from established routes could hit manufacturers across the state almost immediately. For a state built around auto production, parts, logistics, and just-in-time delivery, the margin for error is thin and the tolerance for drama is basically zero. Canadian officials are making the same argument from the other side of the line, but with a different edge. They say the border is not a symbolic scoreboard for sovereignty theater. It is infrastructure that supports jobs, tax revenue, and industrial planning. On both sides, one Canadian official, speaking in the language of trade diplomacy, said the goal is to keep freight moving and avoid self-inflicted damage that would punish carriers and consumers more than it would punish any political target. Truckers, meanwhile, are not pretending this is some abstract policy seminar. Carriers and dispatchers say they are watching the dispute with the same cold attention they give fuel prices and weather. Alert, because a change in border policy can alter route selection, insurance costs, and delivery windows overnight. We do not have the luxury of waiting for politicians to sort out the optics, one fleet operator said, adding that trucking companies will keep choosing the crossing that gets freight through fastest and cheapest. That is where the whole mess gets brutally simple. The White House can talk leverage, Michigan can talk industrial exposure, Ottawa can talk fairness, and carriers can talk efficiency. But the market is already doing the math. If one side makes the border less predictable, freight does what freight always does. It moves away from friction and toward reliability. Reuters also noted that the dispute is unfolding as both governments are trying to project strength without spooking investors or disrupting supply chains that have been built over decades. That balancing act is fragile, because the same officials who want to look tough are also responsible for keeping assembly lines fed and export lanes open. The result is a policy standoff where every quote sounds firm, but every institution is quietly admitting the same thing. The border is a pressure point, not a prop. Michigan business voices have been especially blunt about that reality. They say even short-lived uncertainty can force shippers to reroute, reschedule, or pad costs into contracts, which then get passed along to buyers and consumers. Canadian trucking representatives say the same thing in plainer terms. If the crossing becomes a headache, the load goes somewhere else. And once that habit changes, it does not snap back just because a politician declares victory. Every quote points to the same fault line. New crossing data from 2025 and the opening weeks of 2026 show that freight around the Windsor-Detroit corridor is no longer behaving like a temporary reaction to political noise. It is being reorganized into a new pattern, with carriers steadily favoring routes that offer fewer delays, lower uncertainty, and more predictable processing times. That shift matters because supply chains do not reset on command. Once shippers, dispatchers, insurers, and customs brokers build new routines around a crossing, those routines start to harden into contracts, software settings, staffing plans, and delivery schedules, which makes reversal far harder than any one-off policy announcement suggests. The numbers point to a structural reroute rather than a short-lived detour. Through 2025, commercial traffic data showed a sustained rebalancing of truck flows across key Great Lakes crossings. And early 2026 readings suggest that pattern is still holding, with freight continuing to cluster around the lanes that have already proven faster to clear and easier to price. That is the part policymakers keep pretending they can wave away. They can talk tough, announce pressure, or hint at leverage, but the market response is not a mood swing. It is an operating decision. And once a carrier has spent months or quarters optimizing around one route, it does not casually roll that decision back because somebody in Washington wants a better headline. Supply chain managers understand this in the least glamorous way possible. Every reroute creates its own little ecosystem. Warehouses adjust cutoff times, drivers learn new timing windows, brokers rewrite assumptions, and manufacturers rework inbound schedules, which means the new route stops being an alternative and starts becoming the default. By early 2026, that is exactly what the data is signaling, and the crossings that gained volume in 2025 did not just get a one-time bump, they absorbed habits. And habits in logistics are sticky because they are built into cost models, service guarantees, and the quiet math of who absorbs a delay when the clock runs out. And once that math changes, it changes downstream too. A parts supplier that shifts pickups, a distributor that changes border timing, or a carrier that locks in a different lane for reliability is not just reacting to politics. It is rewriting the commercial map in real time, one load at a time. That is why the idea of snapping freight back into an older pattern sounds nice on TV and looks ridiculous in practice. The reroute is already embedded in the system, and the deeper it gets, the more expensive it becomes to unwind. This is no temporary detour. Canada's trade negotiators are moving on three clocks at once: political, economic, and strategic, as the fight over the Gordie Howe Bridge becomes less about one crossing and more about how the North American border is being reset in real time. Politically, the timing is brutal for Washington and Ottawa alike. Every new threat, counter-threat, or public ultimatum now lands in a system where carriers have already adjusted their behavior, which means officials are no longer arguing over theory, but over a pattern that is already underway. That is why the bridge dispute has taken on a larger meaning. It is not just a bilateral spat. It is a test of whether political pressure can still override commercial reality. Economically, the trade file is moving faster than the rhetoric. Once routing decisions settle into pricing models, insurance assumptions, and delivery contracts, they stop being temporary workarounds and start becoming the default operating plan that gives Canada's negotiators leverage, but it also narrows the room for theatrics because the market does not wait for a press conference to catch up. It just keeps moving. Strategically, Ottawa's response is to treat the border less like a single choke point and more like a network that can be diversified, hardened, and rebalanced. That is the real play here, not trying to win a fight over symbolism, but making sure Canadian trade is less exposed to any one crossing. any one political mood swing, or any one Washington demand. In plain English, Canada is trying to turn a bridge fight into a broader border realignment. That is why the negotiator's job now is not simply to defend one project, it is to manage a shift in bargaining power while freight flows, customs routines, and commercial expectations keep evolving underneath the headline drama. The longer that shift lasts, the more it changes what both governments can credibly demand from each other. For policymakers, the lesson is uncomfortable but simple. Border politics still matters, tariffs still matter, and ownership fights still matter. But they now operate inside a logistics system that has its own momentum. Once that system starts favoring one set of routes over another, it becomes very hard to force it back with slogans, threats, or late-breaking outrage. So the bridge fight is no longer just about concrete tolls or opening dates. It is about whether the border itself will be managed as a fixed line on a map or as a living commercial system that keeps adapting to pressure. The border is being redrawn in real time.